Few minutes, just a couple of minutes, so everybody settles down.
No problem.
So the audience are some master students, some PhD scholars, and many of our faculty colleagues.
Great.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first lecture in the Dean's Global Leaders Lecture Series of the School of International Studies. This lecture series is part of the manifold ideas and initiatives envisioned by our Dean, Professor Amitabh Mattu, to deepen global engagement and bring to our school voices that shape international thoughts and practice. The series reflects the school's enduring commitment to intellectual excellence, global dialogue, and social responsibility. We are honored today to begin this series with an eminent scholar and public intellectual, Professor Marcia Langton, Order of Australia, who joins us today as the inaugural speaker. Professor Langton is one of Australia's most respected Indigenous academics and a globally renowned scholar. She is an anthropologist and geographer, and since 2000, she has held the Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. Her scholarship spans political and legal anthropology, Indigenous agreements, resource governance, Indigenous art and culture, and the interface between Indigenous communities and the state. Her work has significantly shaped both academic discourse and public policy. Interestingly, she has played a very important role in the Empowered Communities Project, under contract to the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet of Australia. And she has also served on the expert panel on constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. It's a huge testament to her deep engagement with issues of justice, governance, and Indigenous rights. And for all this, the Australian government recognized her outstanding contributions to anthropology and the advocacy of Aboriginal rights, and therefore she was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in 1993. Professor Langton is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. She's a fellow of Trinity College, Melbourne, and she's an honorary fellow of Emmanuel College, University of Queensland. She, in further recognition of her standing as one of Australia's most respected Indigenous academics, Professor Langton was appointed in 2017 as the first Associate Provost at the University of Melbourne, and that's a big recognition. So, Professor Langton, with these words, I request you to deliver your lecture titled, very interesting, Listening to Country, Songlines, Knowledge, and Indigenous Sovereignty. Over to you, Professor Langton.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dr. Kashyap. I'm very grateful to you for that very kind introduction, and also to Dr. Prakash for welcoming me to the university, and Professor Amitabh Mattu and Apurva Karaka. So, and I also want to thank the Australian High Commissioner and his wife, Professor Susan Marks, and their wonderful team who've been involved in the exhibition at the Humayun, I hope I've said that correctly, Tomb Museum.
Humayun's
Humayun's Tomb. The museum has an exhibition called Songlines. I went there yesterday and it's very, very impressive. And I recommend it to you. So if you want to have a better understanding of what I propose to talk to you about today, a very visceral understanding, have a look at that exhibition. It's really worth it. So thank you so much for having me here. It's an enormous honour to be giving this lecture, this inaugural lecture in the series. and to meet everyone here. I have been at the University of Melbourne since 2000, so 25 years, quarter of a century. I was born in Queensland. My grandfather's people are called the Yiman people, and my grandmother spoke a number of languages. One of them was Bidjara, which is the surviving language in that area. I grew up in Queensland, but I've lived in various parts of Australia, and as you know now, mostly in Melbourne for the last 25 years. And I've worked across Australia as an anthropologist and geographer in order to document the Aboriginal view of the world, of our knowledge systems, our attachments to land or country, as we call it, and to explain our view of our history as well. So if you find my publications in the library or online, you'll have an understanding of what I've been trying to do, and that is to overcome the burden of a very British view of Aboriginal people, which from the beginning was extraordinarily racist. So the British arrived officially in 1788 at Port Jackson. Australia will celebrate on the 26th of January, Australia Day. However, you know, it's not a date that we Aboriginal people celebrate. The British arrived and created the colony of New South Wales, not Australia. In 1788, they created the colony of New South Wales. And from there, they set out to colonise the rest of Australia. And they did so very brutally. Some demographic historians have calculated our original population at perhaps between 1 million and 2 million people before the British arrived. And in one census in 1900 or 1901, which is sometimes published on our Australian Bureau of Statistics website, a census showed that there were 30,000 full-blood Aboriginal people still surviving. And so many Aboriginal people refer to what happened in their areas as genocide because, as they see it, there was a very deliberate intent to annihilate them as peoples. And it's very difficult to disagree with them, actually. And certainly there are people who agree that this is what happened in what is now Tasmania, originally the colony of Van Diemen's Land, the island to the south, and also in Western Australia. So a Human Rights Commission inquiry in the 1990s, an inquiry into the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families did find, in fact, that what occurred in Western Australia was genocide under a particular clause of the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide because of the very deliberate attempt by the government official A.O. Neville to eliminate Aboriginal culture by removing children from their families. So we don't know how many children were forcibly removed, tens of thousands for sure. And in 2008, the Prime Minister of Australia, the then Prime Minister, and until very recently, the Australian High Commissioner in Washington, United States of America, Washington, D.C., Kevin Rudd, gave an apology in Parliament for the many crimes that were committed against Aboriginal families by stealing their children. So it was called the Apology to the Stolen Generations. And following the human rights inquiry and the apology, The only compensation, official compensation, was the annual funding of a body called the Healing Foundation, aimed at assisting the victims and their survivors to overcome the trauma. And there were many traumas. So it's important to understand that background. But there's another part probably of more interest to you that you also need to understand about our situation in Australia. It was very late in colonial times when the British actually recognised Aboriginal people as subjects of the Crown. Before that, there was no status whatsoever, probably in the animal category. And so there were debates in the courts about whether or not Aboriginal people could be tried because they may or may not be subjects. However, at my university, the University of Melbourne, the first Chancellor, Redmond Barry, was also a legal advocate. He was what we would now call a solicitor or a barrister, and he represented 2 Tasmanian Aboriginal men, and they had killed some whalers who had been sexually assaulting women in southwest Victoria. They were brought to the courts. They lost their case and they were hung in Melbourne, and they were the first executions in the city of Melbourne. And he defended them, and he tried to argue at a native title case, and he was very disappointed that he lost the case. So our status was not clarified for many decades to come. When the colonies federated as a single federation in 1901, after many constitutional debates, the Australian Constitution, approved by Westminster in London on the 1st of January 1901, excluded Aboriginal people entirely from the Constitution in 2 ways. One, under Section 51, we could not be counted in the census. And number 2, the Commonwealth Parliament could not make any laws for us. And so, in fact, were non-citizens. And in all jurisdictions, the right to vote was denied, and in most jurisdictions, Aboriginal people and, of course, Torres Strait Islander people were treated as wards of the state under state and territory legislation. The Northern Territory was governed by the Commonwealth after 1911. It was originally part of the colony of South Australia and then the state of South Australia until 1911, when it came under the Commonwealth. So the Commonwealth and the states treated Aboriginal people as wards of the state, that is, non-citizens, like, delinquent children. And there were draconian colonial laws that derived from the colonial laws that controlled Aboriginal people, incarcerated Aboriginal people in reserve settlements, areas reserved for Aboriginal people under administrative rule. In my state, in Queensland, not allowed to marry without the permission of Native Affairs, not allowed to travel, and many other restrictions. People were used as basically a slave labour. The historians call it indentured labour. And I'm waiting for smart young historians to sort that out and finally call it slave labour. My grandfather was one of them. And we didn't get the right to vote in Queensland until sort of the 1960s, sort of the 1970s. It was never really clear. We don't have good local histories in Australia of the Aboriginal status, because our history departments regarded Aboriginal history as a non-issue. not something that a good history student would want to study. There are a few renegades who've done marvellous work, but there's so much more to be done, and I recommend to you Henry Reynolds' work and Lyndall Ryan, James Boyce. I could recommend so many more, but Rachel Perkins and I edited a companion book to our First Australians television series, which you ought to be able to access, and that provides an overview of our history. And more recently, Rachel Perkins has done a 3-part television series on the frontier massacres, of which there were hundreds, called The Australian Wars, and she's just published a companion volume called The Australian Wars. So I refer those to you. So that background is important to understand. In 1967, the federal government instituted a referendum on the question of removing the 2 racially discriminatory clauses that denied us any status from our constitution. And in 1967, well over 90% of the Australian voters voted yes to remove those 2 racially discriminatory clauses. And so that really was fundamental to all the reforms that followed. So, as a result of that, all the jurisdictions allowed franchise, the right to vote for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Finally, we were allowed to own property. Finally, the Commonwealth was allowed to make laws for us. And hence you have, for instance, the Native Title Act, and so much other Commonwealth legislation relating to cultural heritage and so on that has vastly improved our lives and our status in the nation. Now, that's not to say that racial discrimination disappeared. The racial discrimination in Australia, for any of you who have visited Australia, you will have noticed that, it's racism is a part of the air in Australia. It's very difficult not to see the racism because it is it's kind of at a subconscious level, as well as being in a very odd way. Each jurisdiction in the world has its own peculiar forms of racism, and Australia certainly has its own peculiar forms of racism, actually. And so that's not to say that we don't welcome the reforms. There have been many, many reforms, as I say, since the 1967 referendum, and they were instigated really at that time under a Liberal government, but very hesitantly. More reform came under Prime Minister Whitlam's government in 1972, but he picked up some of the reforms that the previous Liberal government had instituted, like the Aboriginal Land Rights Act in the Northern Territory, the first recognition of Aboriginal land rights. And so that bill was passed in 1976 as Commonwealth legislation. Now, the reason for that act is important to understand. Gough Whitlam was a very interesting man. He was, in fact, a constitutional lawyer, and he'd served in the Air Force during World War II across the north of Australia, where the Air Force established military airstrips for landing troops and supplies because of the invasion by the Japanese from the north. And he went on these flights across North Australia where there was still a majority of Aboriginal people. So you understand that the British arrived in 1788. There were about 1,100 of them compared to the 1 to 2 million Indigenous people So the British were a tiny minority until well into the 20th century. And as they pushed northwards and the massacring people and murdering people and incarcerating people, they never really got a grip on the north of Australia. Taken by the Aboriginal people of Arnhem Land in the north to secure their customary rights, their native title in land, in the face of a mining company, a Swiss bauxite mining company, and the court ruled against them on the grounds of terra nullius, which is, the thesis by Blackstone in 1832 as a an ex post facto justification for British theft of other people's lands around the country, the ceded colony thesis, right? So Gough Whitlam read the case and he said, no, this is unjust. And so he set up the Land Rights Commission to inquire not whether or not there were Aboriginal land rights, but how to recognise them. And that commission, under one of our chancellors at the University of Melbourne, Sir Edward Woodward, made recommendations on how to recognise land rights. And so Gough Whitlam led the Parliament in legislating for the first land rights in Australia, but only in the Northern Territory. Much later comes the Native Title Act. Now, a Torres Strait Islander man, Koiki Mabo, he was a political activist and he was exiled from his island and sent down to work on the railways by the state. And he ended up eventually in Townsville. And at the James Cook University, he met Henry Reynolds, the historian I mentioned earlier, and another historian, Noel Luce. And they said to him, they were talking about, his rights in the Torres Straits and his life story. He was still a political activist and set up a black school in Townsville. This is in North Queensland. And he believed, as his father had told him, that their land belonged to them. And Henry said to him, no, the Crown took your land. Didn't you know that? And he said, what? And so they explained to him that the Crown had annexed all Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal land, taken all rights in it, and that, in fact, he and his family didn't own anything. And he couldn't believe it. He began to understand it and he began writing his diaries. His diaries are in the National Library of Australia. And he asked them to help him take this matter to court. And they found wonderful lawyers in Melbourne, Ron Caston, Brian Kean Cohen, Greg McIntyre, and a legal team. And they took the case to the Queensland Supreme Court and eventually the High Court. It's a long story. It's a marvellous story. And they won in the High Court. And the High Court recognised native title in 1992, right? And then by 1994, we had the Native Title Act legislated by the Commonwealth Parliament. And now it's very difficult to prove your native title rights, but, many people have, and there are agreements under the Native Title Act, and I regard it as a very significant reform. So when you understand this situation, this long history, you'll understand why we argued for a constitutional change, and eventually, under our present Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, he agreed in 2023 to a referendum to put the question to the voters of Australia, should Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people be recognised in the Constitution by means of establishing a representative body called The Voice. And unlike the referendum in 1967, 61% of Australian voters voted against it and 39% for. And so we lost it. We lost that referendum and it caused us a great deal of harm. It, however, alerted us, because of the very ugly campaign leading up to the referendum to the acceleration and growth of racism in Australia. And some of us leaders wrote an article in the Lancet on racism during the referendum. And the racism expressed by the No campaign, by many of the very same people now in the opposition, in the Liberal Party and the National Party and the minor parties in our parliament, was so bad that the Australian government funded special psychological counselling for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who were harmed by the racism. And our health services established a 1300 free call counselling service to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people because of the extent of the racism against us during 2022 and 2023. There was a marked, horrifying rise in suicides and reports of mental trauma from the racism. I won't go through the actual racist statements, but just to say this: it was a highly organised, funded misinformation campaign by a shadowy American political alliance, which appeared in Australia under the name Advance. And they're associated with CPAC. Now, I did learn, what is it? The Conservative Political Action Conference. And this is a conference network for not just conservatives, but the far right as well. And they have conferences in the United States, in the UK, in Turkey, in Hungary, and in Australia. Now, ironically, during this time, the chair of CPAC was a very right-wing Aboriginal man, Warren Mundine. And he and a very right-wing Aboriginal senator, Senator Jacinta Jumpy Jimper Price, joined forces with the opposition leader Peter Dutton and the coalition parties to prosecute the No case against the referendum. There are very suspicious circumstances in relation to the funding of the campaign and the benefits that they received, but none of which constitute grounds for a court case. But it's also very obvious that a mining industry network called Atlas funded the campaign, and the list of donors has been published and republished in Australia. So very wealthy philanthropists like the mining magnate Gina Rinehart of Hancock Mining, and the man who owns Ainsworth, who owns all the pokie machines in Australia, he funded it. Blackmore's Pharmacies, they funded it. So a lot of big corporations funded the No campaign. But the style of misinformation is, straight out of the Steve Bannon playbook. And the kind of, Cambridge Analytica interference with an election that became familiar to us when Trump first came to power. Same were used in Australia in this referendum campaign. And if I were to sum up why I thought that No campaign was so vicious, so well funded, I would say that it is because there's a perception in a part of the mining industry in Australia that any Aboriginal rights is a detriment to the mining industry. So it goes back to the old 1980s Hancock era, Gina Rinehart's father, who publicly advocated for chemical castration of Aboriginal men in order for him to do his mining, right? And he did set up some of the biggest iron ore mines in the Pilbara in Western Australia. And to this day, Australia is rich on the back of the mining industry. So that's a quick rundown of it. Where are we now? We have no representative body, no Commonwealth representative body. The state of Victoria, about a month ago, did legislate an extraordinary achievement for the Aboriginal people of Victoria, a statewide treaty act, and that would have to be the subject of another lecture, which I'm happy to do online sometime if you want, a briefing on that. And so it is the first treaty in Australia. So Australia as a settler colony, a British settler colony, was unique in the British colonial history in that no treaty was ever settled with Australian Indigenous people. And this legislated treaty in Victoria in 2025 is the first treaty with Indigenous people in Australia in our history. And it is a remarkable piece of legislation, very, very interesting. And the state of South Australia legislated before this, probably about 3 years ago, a representative body called the South Australian Voice for Aboriginal people in South Australia. There's a possibility that in New South Wales, that the state will continue to support the development of a treaty process there, but nothing else throughout Australia exists. And so Albanese has retreated to the idea that's called in Australia of practical reconciliation. We can reconcile with the Aborigines by fixing their plumbing and housing. So that's where we're at the moment, and I've probably spoken for too long, but I hope that that's helpful in giving you a quick summary of where we are in Australia politically as Indigenous Australians.
Professor Langton, thank you very much. But I would like to request you to explain to us what are songlines.
Songlines,
yes.
Yeah. Okay. So as I said, I encourage you to look at the exhibition.
Yes.
Songlines is a deceptive term. It was sort of invented by Bruce Chatwin, a British travelogue writer who went to Alice Springs in the 1980s. He wrote the very famous best-selling travelogue about the Indigenous people down at the bottom of South America. It was called In Patagonia. When he came to Australia, he spoke to, the white people and a few Aboriginal people in Alice Springs in the centre of Australia, and he heard about this religious phenomenon which he called Songlines, and so he published a book called Songlines, became world famous, so everybody uses his term. But actually, there are lots of different styles of Aboriginal music, and religious song forms and popular song forms, lots of different styles. And what he's referring to is one style. In fact, it's one type of which there are several styles. So in ethnomusicology, we call this type of song a song series. And so there's a series of songs which are expressed in an esoteric language, not ordinary language, but in esoteric language, in an esoteric music style of singing. And in the case of the ancestral journey depicted in the exhibition at the Humayun Tomb Museum, you will hear the singing of women, and the only musical instrument is the clapping. And it is, it sort of sounds like this. So, I'm not singing the lyrics because I can't, but that's what it sounds like. And that's the musical accompaniment. And that's done by women. Men have they can also sing this song series, and they have clapsticks, wooden clapsticks. And there must also be dancing, a particular dancing style, and you'll see videos of that at the exhibition. Now, the story then is about the seven sisters, who are the Pleiades, the Pleiades constellation, and they are tracked and stalked by the Orion character, who is Watiniru. Watiniru is a man who lusts after the women, particularly the youngest sister, and he chases them eternally across the skies, and they evade him with and manage to escape from his magical attacks on them. And so every year the Pleiades appears in a certain part of the sky when it's brightest, and this is when the inma or ceremonies are performed, although they can be performed at any time. And it is a very long ancestral pathway that crosses the deserts of Australia from the east to the west, or is it? Sorry, from the west to the east. And in this exhibition, a lot of detail about the western end of the ancestral journey and all the songs of the Madu people and the places where the seven sisters stopped and visited. So I was asked yesterday, are they real people? Yes, of course, but they are also ancestral spiritual people. And so there are many things all at once. And so too, Watiniru, the star man who chases them. And then I'm more familiar with the eastern end of the ancestral journey. So this pathway of these ancestors is probably about 2,000 kilometres long. And many sacred sites along the path. And these are the places that where the seven sisters and Watiniru did certain things that continue to be celebrated. I think these song series, this vast song series, is probably more than 30,000 years old because of, what's referenced in the songs, waterholes and so on, because Australia's dried up since the end of the last ice age. And you can see in the paintings the depictions of waterholes. So why so many depictions of waterholes? Because you need to know where water is as the continent's drying up over this very long period of time. And the water, of course, is very sacred. There's different kinds of water. There's surface water. There's also underground water. And that's, one of the big hidden references, as you'll see in the exhibition. So that's a kind of an explanation of it. But we do have other song forms, ceremonial forms. But this particular exhibition is created and in many ways curated by the actual traditional owners who tell their own stories. So it's marvellous.
So it's a long weekend for us, and it's the best weather in Delhi. So I think all of us are inspired to visit the exhibition at Humayun's tomb. We must do that. And Professor Langton, if I may collectively take everybody's voice, I'll just like to say that we got a very honest understanding of the Aboriginal history of Australia, moving beyond the colonial narratives. And this long, complex, troubled relationship between Aboriginal and the state, you have simplified, and we really appreciate how you know every fact. You have everything in your head without a reference to the paper. So that's incredible. So with this, what I'll do is I'll open the floor for questions. Yes, we already have a colleague, and do identify yourselves. So we'll open for a Q&A.
Thank you.
So I'm Dr. Shubhamitra Das. I'm in the faculty of Indo-Pacific Studies. I look into the Pacific side of Indo-Pacific. My question is, Professor Langton, you are making a distinction between the Aborigines and the Torres Strait Islanders. Are they not the same?
Good question. No, very different peoples. So the first, the most ancient evidence of Aboriginal presence on the continent is 65,000 years, found by Professor Clarkson and his team at a place in Western Arnhem Land. They dated the excavation materials to 65,000 years before the present. So our ancestors, arrived in North Australia at least 65,000 years ago. The Torres Strait Islanders have probably been in the Torres Straits for about 20,000 years. So, look, Australia was once joined to Papua New Guinea, and by the Sunda, I think it was called the Sunda Strait, right? The Sunda, and it's obvious. But however, between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, or New Guinea, there is a very deep, one of the deepest channels, and it's called the Wallace Line. And it's very interesting because difficult to navigate. So people had to, throughout history and deep history, travel by sea to get to the Australian continent, even before the seas rose and New Guinea was separated. But it's obvious that people came by seacraft from the northwest, from Indonesia, what is now Indonesia, and also by land when Australia was joined to New Guinea. They came around that way. But the seas rose, and people in what is now Australia were cut off from the rest of the world, except that they did continue to sail the seas, travel the seas. But the Torres Strait Islanders came, from a different people, from the more Melanesian people, about 20,000 years ago, and settled the Torres Straits, which is a small archipelago between the tip of Queensland and New Guinea. And their languages are a completely different language family from ours. Except for the western side people on Horn Island and Thursday Island, they are Aboriginal, but the eastern Torres Strait Islanders are Melanesian and have Melanesian languages.
I did finish my questions yet. One more question I have. What is the role of the civil society in campaigning and lobbying for getting the Aboriginal voice into the parliament?
The role of civil society. Well, there was before we had any rights, a national Aboriginal organisation called the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. And it was set up back in the 1950s. Torres Strait Islanders joined later. And there was actually a vote amongst Aboriginal people to allow them to join our political organisation. But this organisation came out of the old, what were called advancement associations, local community Aboriginal groups who set themselves up as small political organisations called advancement associations for the advancement of Aborigines, using the horrible English of the times, right? And they, for instance, started the day of mourning on January 26, mourning for the dead. They went on strike. Many of them were, picking cotton in the fields. They were fruit pickers, and they went on strike to try to get more rights, as did people across the Northern Territory and Western Australia, who were, the cattle workers. And so there were many Aboriginal strikes. So there was a maritime strike in the Torres Strait Islands as well. There was a strike on Palm Island. And because of these strikes and these small political organisations, the Australian unions joined forces, as did some churches, and they became members eventually of the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. So this is prior to the 1967 referendum. And it was this organisation, under the leadership of Faith Bandler, who was not in fact Aboriginal, but a South Sea Islander. And her people had been kidnapped by white people. So they used to take their ships out into the Pacific, kidnap people off the islands, off the beaches, and bring them to Queensland to work as slaves in the sugarcane fields. So there were many of them in Queensland, and she joined our association, and she led for CATSI, and she led the campaign for the referendum, and the only successful referendum recognising Aboriginal rights. And so it was through that organisation, first of all, that non-Indigenous civil society joined us. Although there had been, occasional and very random support for us, particularly from particular kinds of Christians, such as Quakers, and an occasional liberal Christian. Most Christians in Australia in colonial times did not think well of Aboriginal people or advocate for our rights. It was very, very rare. And so after that, that civil society support for Aboriginal people grew, especially through the reconciliation movement, which was an official movement set up after the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which reported to Parliament in 1991, and reconciliation was one of its recommendations to overcome the very obvious racism that led to the deaths in custody. And so that movement's still going. It was under legislation for the first 10 years as the Aboriginal Reconciliation Act or something like that. Then it reached the end of its legislative term. And when the legislation was, nullified by Parliament, Australians set up a foundation for Aboriginal reconciliation, and it continued as Reconciliation Australia and is still operating today. And there are small reconciliation groups across the country who turn out and support us on many of our campaigns. But it's they're a minority, as you can see from the outcome of the 2023 referendum.
So Professor Vara first and then Monique.
Thank you, Professor Langton, for that very detailed and comprehensive analysis of what the Aboriginal community in the US, in Australia, have gone through. In fact, a lot of thoughts are in my mind. Why I brought the US is essentially, in some sense, to draw a kind of a parallel between what the African Americans in the US had gone through and what the Aboriginal had gone through in Australia. And I also would like to bring in the South Africans, particularly the natives of Australia, and also let me add what some of the communities in India have been going through, particularly the Dalit community and some of the tribal communities and the minorities. Even as I speak today, according to the National Crimes Record Bureau, there are about 57,888 atrocities being committed against the Dalit community.
Sorry, 557,000 what?
57,000 atrocities.
Atrocities.
Yes, being committed against the Dalit community, and then about 12,000 against the tribal community.
Yeah.
So in such a context, you have certain parallels across the world in terms of the discrimination and exploitation,
And the violence.
yeah, that are really, an integral part of our society.
Yeah.
So in such a context, how does one actually really, in some sense, mobilize some of these elements to make sure that there is justice, equality, and dignity for all?
That's
in
the
fact,
hope.
2 days back, the Americans celebrated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s King's Day. In fact, he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So how do
Well, yeah.
this into the larger context? See, there is an element of local and global
Yeah.
dimension
Yeah.
that need to really work together to see that there is equality and justice for all.
This is why human rights is so important, and the idea of human dignity. Yeah. And you can't have rights for some and not for others. There have to be rights for all. I can see the parallels you're drawing. In fact, probably about 15 years ago, maybe even more, I was commissioned to write a study for the United Nations, a desktop study, for the Office of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I was, given a sort of random bit of the world to do a desktop study of compliance with Article 8J, I think it is, of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which required member states who were party to the convention to report on how they were assisting Indigenous, traditional, local people to preserve their traditional knowledge related to biological diversity. And I looked at what was happening in India at the time, and it was very inspirational. With the cases that were being prosecuted by your government in relation to the neem tree, turmeric, and other vegetal, communities that are very important for local people here, and also your databases and seed banks and so on. So, there are many, many ways of protecting Indigenous rights. And what I saw India doing, and also the Philippines at that time, and I don't know what's happening now, was very inspirational to us. And we then set up databases in Australia, because you don't know what Indigenous people have rights in unless you document it, right? Because most Indigenous societies are oral. They have oral traditions, and their Indigenous knowledge traditions are oral. So the Convention on Biological Diversity recognises traditional knowledge systems, traditional ecological knowledge systems. And India is in that belt, that global belt around the equator, where not just biological diversity, mega diversity exists, but in conjunction with it, human diversity, linguistic diversity, and intensity. So many Indigenous people, many of them called local or tribal or traditional, in that equatorial belt, who have lived in these environments and preserved knowledge systems about them that are very important, and actually, are the subject of piracy, pharmaceutical piracy, and so on. So even while I do understand exactly, well, not exactly, but I have some understanding of what's happened and been happening to the tribal peoples, the minority peoples here in India, at the same time, they've got something that we haven't got. I've got to say, they've got that recognition, and also I believe they do have rights under the ILO.
India is not a signatory.
It's not a signatory?
No.
No?
No.
Wasn't it a signatory originally?
At the moment, it is not a signatory, but we have our own Indigenous rights framework, very robust.
Right. I thought India was a signatory to the original ILO.
Originally,
And it's not anymore.
No.
Really? See, there's something that I've just learned. Okay, so we looked up to India when India was a signatory to the ILO.
At the moment, it is.
It's not. So the rights of tribal people set out in the ILO, we didn't have, right? So, I need to come and learn about your Indigenous rights framework, actually.
Yes,
yeah.
Definitely.
But I do understand. I met tribals back in the early 1980s when we were going to the UN for the first time to try to get our rights. I do understand a bit about what's happened here. But there really needs to be a lot more comparative studies, as you say, to bring together these themes. Because some of it, like in South Africa and here, arises from British colonialism, but it's also related to, the social and geographical circumstances of these, post-colonial nations too. We can't blame it all on British colonialism. And, even while we have a lot in common with African Americans in the United States, particularly in relation to imprisonment, deaths in custody, treatment by the police, do you know that Indigenous Australians, according to the reports, the official reports, the most incarcerated people in the world? So, I agree. Human dignity, rights for all, human rights. We have to keep working on it, and we, need to elaborate it and, start innovating about how to have rights recognised, which is why I mentioned the Convention on Biological Diversity. Those innovations I thought were terrifically important.
Yeah, in some senses, casteism, predates racism. I think, of course, really, the real original, evolution of these hierarchical structures that need to be broken. Those things.
True.
Mallika?
Thank you, Professor. I have some specific questions. If you feel that good to hear from you. You are using Australian Indigenous people and not Aboriginal people. You did use, but our lingo, as our colleagues were asking, they were constantly using Aboriginal people, which is absolutely a colonial term.
Yeah.
Now, having said this, Indigenous word itself is a highly debated, highly contested, highly rejected word, not among the governments, but the social scientists. Even the mainstream social scientists do not like the word Indigenous. May I take this opportunity to know how would you like to see the word Indigenous? How would you like to define Indigenous people? Because the trend in mainstream social science is to put it as an identity category. It is not. Indigenous people are not an identity category, but the trend is. So I would like you to reflect upon your thoughts on Indigenous people first. And the second, just a query. The relations between Maoris and the New Zealand government are comparatively perhaps better. But now they are going back on their words on all the treaties. Now there is a major conflict and their words. So could you just throw some light why in New Zealand they were not called Aboriginal New Zealanders, but New Zealanders, but Maoris? Thank you.
So there's a big difference between Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal people, and Maori. We have hundreds of languages. I mean, the British did their best to wipe us out, and so a lot of the languages are in the highly endangered or extinct category, but there are also many language revival attempts, and there are many spoken languages, surviving spoken languages. However, the Maori have one language with a couple of weird dialects, but it's one language. And it is you can actually hear that language throughout Polynesian Pacific. It sounds pretty much the same as Hawaiian, Tahitian, and they've been around for about 2,000 years. They came down from East Asia about 2,000 years ago. So an enormous difference between us. They have, kings and queens and a warrior caste and forms of horticulture, whereas our societies are very, very different. Crossing the entirety of Australia, there are probably 6 different types of economic systems, right? Because look at our coastlines, we're the biggest island continent, right? So fishing and, canoes and harvesting fish from fish traps, ancient stone fish traps, and then from the very rich coast to the deserts, you have, hunting, gathering, and some propagation of plants, even in the desert. What the British saw, however, was the Maori with their warrior caste and Aboriginal people who are very peaceful and much more sparsely occupying the country. So they regarded us pretty much as animals, right? But they regarded the Maori as a formidable enemy. And, there were armed conflicts, and the Maori managed to get guns they bought guns. There's a long story about how they managed to buy guns, a lot of guns. And there was a treaty. And so the treaty is one of the foundational documents of New Zealand. New Zealand doesn't have a constitution. It has a series of foundational documents, and the treaty with the Maori chiefs at Waitangi is one of their foundational documents. And there are 2 versions, one in Maori, the language of Maori, the Maori, and one in English. And they are different, and the court has said that the treaty has to be interpreted by both the Maori and the English version. They can't ignore the Maori version, right? So as for identity, this is it's a right-wing play, yeah?
Absolutely.
It's
But
just,
no,
it's,
I'm sorry to say, the social scientists, left and right, both agree.
yeah. So, look, I've got to say that the white left in Australia don't get us either, right? And they love to play up the identity thing as against the right. And, they just don't get us at all, really. There are a few who've, done their time in our communities and learnt our languages, who I have a great deal of respect for and, have been really great contributors to understanding Aboriginal societies, but they're in a tiny minority. And so now there is a view in the Indigenous academic world that Indigenous research should be Indigenous-led. Avoid, the peculiar racism and, the canonical view of Aborigines from the white social sciences and anthropologists and even linguists. There's a big debate in Australia about what constitutes a language, because our languages are very different. So Aboriginal people have, for instance, set up their own language map. It's online and it's interactive and it's living. You can add language material at any time. It's Gambay, GAMBAY.com.au, and it's hosted by First Nations languages. And at last count, I think there's something like 650 language varieties uploaded to the site, whereas the linguists, yeah, Whereas the linguists say, oh, they had about 250 languages and there's 12 surviving, right? How would they know? They haven't done a national detailed survey. They just make it up. Whereas with a website that Indigenous speakers of languages can upload their language materials to and tell you the name of their language and the variations of their language, well, it gives you a completely different picture. So that's just one example. And so there was a part of your question that I really wanted to answer. The identity one I just see as, really sloppy right-wing political denial of Indigenous people, denial of the existence of Indigenous people. Well, I mean, basically what they're trying to say to us is that we have no right to assert our existence once we've been encapsulated by a colonial or post-colonial state. So why don't you just...
Very sorry to interrupt you. Would you agree broadly, those who refuse to be subject of European Enlightenment modernity or abide by their own knowledge systems as well as their own knowledge systems as well as lifehold practices which do not fall within the framework of Enlightenment, rational modernity, modern rationality?
Look, I don't think that those choices are even possible. It's not possible in Australia because every Aboriginal group has been contacted and encapsulated within the state in some way. So the choice doesn't even exist for them, right? I would say that, you see, that's a very external view of Aboriginal people, right? I will say that there are some young radicals who ascribe to particular types of political statements or ideas that actually derive from a Western radical tradition, even an Enlightenment tradition. That don't know that because they haven't read enough to know that, right? They haven't read anything about the French Revolution. They don't know where these ideas come from. And they shout slogans like Indigenous sovereignty as if, there is some kind of Indigenous sovereignty that's equivalent to the Westphalian sovereignty, right? They're just, naive. And their ideas are not serious enough to constitute something that we're going to push in a campaign for our actual rights or we kind of have to put our blinkers on and sort of drive through the middle of the noise, yeah, if you understand what I'm saying. They're not serious ideas. Because there are many Aboriginal communities who are practicing something that looks a lot like the sovereignty discussed in the Western Sahara case of the spiritual affiliation to a place. And that's why this exhibition is so beautiful, right? So that, emic inside of you of what it means to belong to a place is what is important to most Aboriginal people, not these, silly left-wing ideas that are really very misinformed. And as a result, the white left-wing then label all of us who talk about our rights as left-wing, and the right think we're left-wing too. Whereas, we're simply saying we exist and we have a right to human rights and dignity.
Yeah, I'm sure there are many more questions, but unfortunately we can't take any more. She has to leave. So I'd request my colleague, Dr. Vineet Prakash, to do the honors.
Thank you, Dr. Pradita. So this has been indeed a really wonderful start to this global lecture series. And thank you so much, Professor Langton, for delivering this lecture, interacting with our faculty and students. It was truly an enlightening experience with regard to what has been happening in Australia. And we can definitely make comparisons to what has happened in the rest of the world, wherever the European settlers went, including in the Americas. Uh, I would also like to thank the team from the Australian High Commission for facilitating this lecture by Professor Langton. Thanks are also due to our dean for envisioning this lecture series. I'm sure under this banner we'll have many more prominent global leaders speaking about issues and what is happening across the world. And the team which has worked to make this lecture series a reality, of which Dr. Rajita is a part, Professor Preeti Singh, she's not around today for certain personal reasons. Thanks are also due to all the faculty members who are present over here and all the students who have made it to this lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just a picture. Yeah.
Maybe we can all come here for a group picture with Professor Langton.
Do you want to say something?
Oh, just thank you. Thank you so much to everybody for coming today. It's been wonderful. It's great to see you all and to meet you all.